Nobody cared about the injured cat at the construction site until this man did something amazing. Rusty was, to put it mildly, a magnificent specimen of ginger cathood. His fur was the color of a freshly poured copper kettle, catching the sunlight that streamed through Mrs. Eleanor Davison's kitchen window and turning it into a fiery halo around his stocky frame. Emerald eyes, flecked with gold, surveyed his domain with a mixture of regal disinterest and simmering curiosity. One ear, neatly notched at the tip, gave him a slightly rakish air, a testament to a long-forgotten tussle with a neighborhood tomcat over a particularly plump robin. Eleanor, a woman whose own hair was the color of faded silver, often said Rusty was her sunshine boy, and indeed, he seemed to radiate warmth. He'd weave between her ankles as she prepared her morning tea, a low rumble of a purr vibrating through his chest. He'd follow her into the small, sun-drenched garden, batting playfully at butterflies that dared to land on her prized rose bushes. He was her constant companion, a furry, four-legged anchor in a world that had become increasingly quiet since her husband, George, had passed away 5 years prior. Their days followed a comfortable rhythm. Mornings were for tea and toast, shared with generous portions of head scratches for Rusty. Afternoons were for quiet naps in sunbeams that stretched across the worn floral rug in the living room. Evenings were for gentle companionship, Eleanor knitting in her armchair, Rusty curled up on a cushion at her feet, the rhythmic click of the needles a soothing lullaby. Their home, a modest two-bedroom bungalow on the outskirts of Harmony Creek, Pennsylvania, had always been a haven of peace. But lately, that peace had been disturbed. A new housing development, Harmony Heights, was being built on the vacant land that bordered Eleanor's property. At first, it had been just a distant hum, the occasional rumble of trucks. But as the weeks passed, the sounds grew louder, closer. Rusty, with his exquisitely sensitive ears, was the first to notice the change. He'd prick his ears, that notched one twitching, and stare intently out the back window towards the rising dust clouds. He'd abandon his favorite napping spot under the lilac bush, choosing instead to sit on the windowsill, his tail lashing back and forth, a low growl rumbling in his throat. Eleanor, too, was concerned. The noise was unsettling, and she worried about the impact on her peaceful neighborhood. She'd mentioned it to her daughter, Carol, during their weekly phone call. "It's getting so loud, dear," she'd said, her voice tinged with anxiety. "I don't like it. It feels like they're building right on top of us." Carol, ever practical, had reassured her. "It'll be finished soon, Mom. And think of the property value increase. You could sell that place for a fortune." But Eleanor didn't care about property values. She cared about her quiet life, her garden, and her Rusty. The fateful morning dawned bright and clear. A slight chill hung in the air, a harbinger of the approaching autumn. Eleanor woke with a tickle in her throat and a slight headache. She attributed it to a change in the weather, a minor cold. She made her tea, but her usual appetite was absent. Rusty, sensing her subdued mood, was unusually attentive. He rubbed against her legs, purring louder than usual, his green eyes filled with a concern that only an animal companion can truly express. After a meager breakfast, Eleanor decided to tend to her roses. She needed to deadhead the spent blooms and apply some fertilizer. She opened the back door, intending to just step out for a few minutes. Rusty, ever vigilant, was at her heels. "Now you stay inside, you hear?" she said, gently nudging him back with her foot. But her mind was already on her roses, and she didn't latch the door securely. It swung slightly ajar, a narrow gap of opportunity. As Eleanor knelt among the rose bushes, snipping away at the faded blossoms, she heard the distant roar of a heavy engine. A construction truck, its bed loaded with steel beams, rumbled past on the newly paved access road. She frowned, a familiar wave of unease washing over her. Meanwhile, Rusty, driven by an irresistible urge to explore, had slipped through the gap in the door. He'd been watching the activity at the construction site for weeks, his feline curiosity piqued by the strange smells and sounds. Today, he decided, was the day he'd investigate. He padded silently across the lawn, his senses on high alert. The scent of freshly turned earth, of diesel and metal, was intoxicating. He crouched low to the ground, his belly almost brushing the grass, as he approached the edge of his familiar world and entered the unknown. A small, fluttering feeling, a mix of excitement and trepidation, filled his chest. He was, after all, a cat of adventure, a ginger explorer, venturing into uncharted territory. He had no way of knowing that this adventure would soon turn into a nightmare. The back door remained ajar, a silent testament to a small oversight that would have profound consequences. Rusty moved with the instinctive stealth of a predator, his low crouch making him almost invisible against the tall grass that fringed the edge of Mrs. Davison's property. The familiar scent of home, roses, lavender, and the faint, comforting aroma of Eleanor's lavender soap, faded behind him, replaced by a sharp, acrid cocktail of unfamiliar odors. Diesel fumes hung heavy in the air, mingling with the metallic tang of freshly cut steel and the dusty smell of concrete. The transition from suburban tranquility to the raw, chaotic energy of the construction site was jarring. One moment, Rusty was navigating a neatly manicured lawn. The next, he was stepping onto a landscape of churned earth, piles of gravel, and towering stacks of building materials. It was a world of giants, where human-sized objects were dwarfed by the sheer scale of the project. The roar of machinery was deafening. Backhoes growled like metal beasts, their giant claws tearing at the earth. Dump trucks rumbled past, their tires spitting gravel. The rhythmic clang of hammers on steel echoed across the site, punctuated by the shouts of workers communicating above the din. For Rusty, whose hearing was far more acute than a human's, it was a sensory assault. His ears swiveled, trying to pinpoint the source of each sound. His whiskers twitched nervously, and his eyes, wide and dilated, darted from one object to another. He crept forward cautiously at first, his paws sinking slightly into the loose soil. He navigated a maze of obstacles. Discarded pallets, coils of thick electrical cable, stacks of plywood, and trenches dug for foundations. The ground was uneven, littered with sharp stones and pieces of scrap metal. It was a far cry from the soft grass and smooth paving stones of his backyard. The construction site was a labyrinthine world of half-built structures. Walls of raw concrete rose towards the sky, their surfaces pockmarked with holes and reinforced with steel bars. Scaffolding clung to the sides of buildings like metal skeletons, providing precarious walkways for the workers. The air was thick with dust, stirred up by the constant movement of vehicles and men. Rusty coughed, a small, rasping sound lost in the cacophony. He found himself drawn towards a large area where concrete was being poured. A cement mixer churned relentlessly, its rotating drum spewing a thick, gray slurry into a wooden formwork. Workers in hard hats and high-visibility vests bustled around, shouting instructions and guiding the flow of the concrete. The air here was particularly pungent, the smell of wet cement sharp and almost overwhelming. Unbeknownst to Rusty, this was the area where the accident would soon occur. A large stack of plywood sheets leaned precariously against a temporary support structure, near where a group of workers were preparing to lay a section of concrete floor. The ground beneath the plywood was uneven, and the stack was not properly secured. It was a hazard waiting to happen. Mark Olson, a burly man with calloused hands and a weathered face, wiped sweat from his brow with the back of his arm. He was a seasoned construction worker, having spent the last 20 years of his life on sites just like this one. He was focused on the task at hand, guiding the flow of concrete into the formwork, ensuring it was evenly distributed. The roar of the mixer was a familiar background noise, the shouts of his co-workers a constant rhythm. He was a man of routine, used to the controlled chaos of the construction site. He hadn't noticed the small, ginger cat that had wandered into his workspace, a tiny, vulnerable creature in a world of steel and concrete. He had more pressing things than to look around for any stray animal. He didn't know of the disaster that was to occur very soon. Rusty, disoriented and increasingly frightened, found himself drawn to the stack of plywood. Perhaps it was the relative quiet in that area, a momentary lull in the surrounding noise, or perhaps it was the instinct to seek shelter, to find a place to hide from the overwhelming sensory overload. He crept towards the base of the stack, his body low to the ground, his tail tucked between his legs. He sniffed at the edge of the wood, the rough texture unfamiliar against his sensitive nose. He paused, his ears twitching, trying to decipher the sounds around him. The rhythmic thud of the cement mixer, the shouts of the workers, the distant whine of a power saw, it was all a confusing blur. Suddenly, the ground vibrated. A heavy truck, loaded with more building materials, rumbled past nearby. The vibration, combined with the already unstable nature of the plywood stack, was the final straw. The stack shifted, the temporary supports groaning under the strain. Rusty, startled by the sudden movement, tried to dart away, but he was too late. The top sheets of plywood, each weighing a considerable amount, slid downwards with terrifying speed. The impact was sudden and brutal. A sheet of plywood, its edge catching Rusty's hindquarters, slammed down on his left leg. It didn't completely crush him, but it pinned him firmly to the ground, trapping his leg beneath its unforgiving weight. A sharp, piercing cry escaped Rusty's throat, a sound of pure agony that was instantly swallowed by the surrounding noise. He struggled frantically, his claws scrabbling at the ground, trying to find purchase, but the weight was too much. He was trapped. The dust stirred up by the falling plywood slowly settled. The construction site continued its relentless activity, oblivious to the small tragedy that had just unfolded. The cement mixer churned, the workers shouted, the machinery roared. Rusty lay panting, his body trembling with pain and fear. His injured leg throbbed with a searing, agonizing pain. He whimpered softly, a small, desperate sound. He tried to move, but any slight shift sent waves of pain shooting through his body. He was alone, trapped, and utterly helpless. Mark Olson was in the middle of directing the concrete pour, his attention focused on ensuring the mixture was evenly distributed. He was a man of routine, his movements precise and efficient. He signaled to the mixer operator to slow the flow, then turned to shout instructions to a coworker who was leveling the concrete with a long-handled tool. He was a man of habit, his days spent navigating the predictable unpredictability of a construction site. He knew the rhythms of the work, the sounds of the machinery, the cadence of the workers' voices. He was attuned to the subtle changes in the environment, the shifts in the wind, the variations in the noise. And then he heard something different, a faint, high-pitched sound, almost imperceptible above the din of the construction site. It was a cry, a whimper, a sound that didn't belong. First, he dismissed it. It was probably just his imagination or some distant piece of machinery. He went back to directing the concrete pour. But the sound persisted, a faint, plaintive cry, cutting through the noise like a thin, sharp blade. It tugged at something within him, a primal instinct, a sense of unease. Mark stopped what he was doing. He looked around, his eyes scanning the area, trying to pinpoint the source of the sound. His coworkers, focused on their tasks, didn't seem to notice anything amiss. He took a few steps, following the sound. It led him towards the stack of plywood, the one that had shifted earlier. He frowned, remembering the near accident. And then he saw him, a small, ginger cat, lying partially hidden beneath the edge of a plywood sheet. Its eyes were wide with terror, its body trembling. Its left hind leg was clearly trapped. Mark's initial annoyance, at the interruption, at the potential delay, instantly evaporated. It was replaced by a surge of concern, a wave of empathy for the injured animal. He knelt down, his rough hands surprisingly gentle as he reached out towards the cat. Mark's eyes, weathered by years of sun and dust, widened slightly as he took in the situation. The cat, a vibrant ginger that stood out starkly against the drab concrete and wood, was clearly in distress. Its emerald eyes, clouded with pain, were fixed on him with a mixture of fear and pleading. The way its leg was pinned beneath the plywood was not good. The angle was unnatural, and a small patch of blood was visible on the fur. "Hey there, little fella," Mark said softly, his voice a low rumble that was surprisingly gentle, considering his usual gruff construction site demeanor. He wasn't a veterinarian, he was a builder, but he'd grown up on a farm and had a basic understanding of animal care. He knew he had to act quickly. He assessed the situation. The plywood sheet was heavy, far too heavy for him to lift alone without risking further injury to the cat. He needed help. "Hey Joe, Frank, get over here," Mark shouted to two of his co-workers who were working nearby, leveling the freshly poured concrete. They looked up, their faces questioning. Joe, a younger man with a perpetual smirk, called back, "What's up, Mark? You finally gonna teach us that fancy concrete dance you've been practicing?" Mark ignored the jibe. "We got a problem. Cat's trapped under that plywood." Frank, a more senior worker, squinted at the scene. "A cat? What's a cat doing on a construction site?" "Doesn't matter," Mark snapped. "Just get over here and help me lift this thing." Joe sauntered over, still smirking. "Seriously, Mark? We're on a tight schedule here. The boss ain't gonna be happy if we fall behind because of a stray cat." Mark's jaw tightened. "Just help me lift it, Joe. Now." Frank, seeing the intensity in Mark's eyes, intervened. "Come on, Joe. Let's just get it done." They positioned themselves around the plywood sheet, but even with three of them, it was a struggle. The wood was heavy and awkward, and they had to be careful not to shift it in a way that would further injure the cat. "Easy, easy," Mark grunted, his muscles straining. "On three. 1, 2, 3. They heaved, but the plywood barely budged. Rusty let out a sharp yelp of pain. Mark cursed under his breath. He realized they needed a lever, something to give them more leverage. He looked around, his eyes scanning the cluttered site for a suitable tool. His gaze fell on a long, sturdy steel bar that was used for reinforcing concrete. It was lying near the base of a half-built wall. "Frank, grab that rebar," he shouted. Frank quickly retrieved the bar. Mark positioned it under the edge of the plywood, using a smaller piece of wood as a fulcrum. "Okay, this time we lift together," Mark instructed. "Slow and steady. We don't want to hurt him any more than he already is." This time, with the added leverage of the steel bar, the plywood lifted. Slowly, painstakingly, they raised it just enough for Mark to reach in and gently pull Rusty free. Mark knew he was taking a risk. He was stopping work, delaying the project, and potentially incurring the wrath of his foreman, a notoriously short-tempered man named Bulldozer Bill. But he couldn't just leave the cat to suffer. He'd seen enough suffering in his life, enough accidents on construction sites, to know that every life, even a small, furry one, was precious. Once Rusty was free, Mark carefully examined his leg. It was clearly broken, the bone protruding at an unnatural angle. The cat was shivering, its breathing shallow and rapid. Mark ripped a strip of cloth from his own work shirt, fashioning a makeshift bandage to try and stabilize the leg. He poured some water from his water bottle onto another piece of cloth and gently cleaned the wound, removing dirt and debris. "Easy, fella, easy," he murmured, his voice soothing. "You're gonna be okay. I'm gonna get you some help." Rusty, despite his pain and fear, seemed to respond to Mark's gentle touch. He let out a weak purr, a faint rumble that was almost lost in the noise of the construction site. It was a sound of trust, a fragile connection between a man and a creature in need. Mark felt a lump form in his throat. He wasn't a sentimental man, but he couldn't deny the wave of compassion that washed over him. Mark cradled Rusty in his arms, the cat surprisingly light despite his solid build. He knew he couldn't leave him there, exposed to the dangers of the construction site. He needed to get him to a vet and fast. "I gotta take him to a vet," Mark announced to Frank and Joe, who were watching with a mixture of surprise and grudging respect. Joe had even lost his smirk. "You're kidding, right?" Joe said, finally finding his voice. Bulldozer Bill is gonna have your hide, Mark. You know how he feels about delays. I don't care, Mark replied firmly. This cat needs help. I'm not leaving him here. He looked down at Rusty, whose eyes were now half closed, his body limp with exhaustion and pain. Hang in there, little fella, he whispered. He made his decision quickly. He couldn't wait for an animal control officer to arrive, and he didn't trust anyone else on the site to take care of the cat. He'd do it himself. Mark carefully carried Rusty to his pickup truck, an old but reliable Ford F-150 that had seen better days. He laid him gently on the passenger seat, using his own work jacket as a makeshift bed. Rusty whimpered softly, but didn't resist. He started the engine and backed out of the construction site, ignoring the stares of his coworkers. He knew he'd face the music later, but right now, his priority was getting Rusty to the nearest animal clinic. The drive was tense. Mark drove carefully, avoiding bumps and potholes, constantly checking on Rusty. The cat was barely conscious, his breathing shallow and ragged. Mark spoke to him in soothing tones, trying to reassure him, even though he knew Rusty probably couldn't understand his words. Just hang on, buddy, he repeated. We're almost there. You're gonna be okay. He remembered a small animal clinic a few miles down the road, Harmony Creek Veterinary Clinic. He'd driven past it countless times, but he'd never had a reason to go in. The clinic was busy. The waiting room was filled with a mix of dogs and cats, their owners looking anxious and concerned. The air was thick with the smell of antiseptic and animal fur. Mark felt out of place. He was a rough construction worker, covered in dust and grime, holding a small, injured cat wrapped in a dirty work jacket. He felt the stares of the other people in the waiting room, a mixture of curiosity and pity. He approached the reception desk, where a young woman with a friendly smile was typing on a computer. I need help, Mark said, his voice hoarse. This cat was injured on a construction site. He needs to see a vet. The receptionist looked at Rusty, her smile fading. Oh, the poor thing. What happened? Mark briefly explained the situation, his voice tight with emotion. The receptionist quickly filled out a form and ushered him to a waiting area. The vet will be with you as soon as possible, she said. Please try to keep him calm. The wait felt like an eternity. Mark sat in a plastic chair, cradling Rusty in his arms, stroking his fur gently. He felt helpless, watching the cat's labored breathing, feeling the tremors that ran through his small body. Finally, a veterinarian, Dr. Emily Carter, a woman with kind eyes and a calm demeanor, called them into an examination room. She gently examined Rusty, her touch expert and reassuring. She felt his leg, her face grim. She listened to his heart and lungs, her expression serious. He's in shock, she said, looking at Mark. His leg is definitely broken, and he's lost some blood. We need to stabilize him and then take x-rays to assess the extent of the damage. Dr. Carter explained the treatment plan. Rusty would need surgery to repair his broken leg, as well as pain medication, antibiotics, and several days of hospitalization. It's going to be expensive, she said gently. We're talking about a significant cost, Mr. Olson. Mark hadn't even thought about the cost. He just reacted, driven by instinct to help the injured animal. Now, faced with the reality of the situation, he felt a wave of anxiety. He was a working man, living paycheck to paycheck. He didn't have a lot of savings. He looked down at Rusty, whose eyes were now closed, his body still. He couldn't just abandon him now. Do what you have to do, Mark said, his voice firm despite the knot of worry in his stomach. I'll figure out the money somehow. Mark paced the small waiting room, his heavy work boots thudding softly on the linoleum floor. He felt a knot of anxiety tightening in his chest. He'd given Dr. Carter the go-ahead for Rusty's surgery, but the reality of the cost was weighing heavily on him. He'd always been a responsible man, careful with his money, but he'd never faced a situation like this before. He pulled out his phone, scrolling through his contacts. He didn't have many close friends or family he could ask for help. He'd always been a bit of a loner, preferring the company of his tools and the satisfaction of a hard day's work. He decided to try a few local animal shelters and rescue organizations. He explained the situation, emphasizing that he'd found Rusty injured on a construction site and that he was willing to cover some of the costs. But he needed help. The responses were disheartening. Most of the shelters were full, their resources stretched thin. They were sympathetic, but they couldn't offer any financial assistance. One woman suggested he consider surrendering Rusty, saying that the shelter might be able to find him a home after he recovered. The thought of surrendering Rusty made Mark's stomach churn. He'd grown attached to the little cat, even in the short time he'd known him. He couldn't just hand him over to strangers. He decided to try another approach. He remembered seeing a local community Facebook group for Harmony Creek, a place where people shared news, events, and lost pet notices. He took a picture of Rusty, his injured leg bandaged, his eyes closed, and posted it on the group, along with a brief explanation of what had happened. "Found this injured cat on the Harmony Heights construction site," he wrote. "He needs surgery, and I'm trying to raise money to help him. Any help would be greatly appreciated." He added his contact information and hit post, feeling a flicker of hope, but also a sense of vulnerability. He'd never asked for help like this before. First, there was silence. Mark checked his phone repeatedly, but there were no comments, no likes, no shares. He started to feel discouraged, wondering if he'd made a mistake. Then, slowly, things started to change. A few people commented, expressing sympathy for Rusty and praising Mark for his kindness. Someone shared the post to another local group. And then, the donations started to trickle in. Small amounts at first $5, $10, $20. Each one was a small victory, a testament to the kindness of strangers. A local news website, the Harmony Creek Chronicle, saw Mark's post and contacted him for an interview. They published a short article about Rusty's rescue, highlighting Mark's compassion and the community's response. The article went viral, at least within the local area. The story of the construction worker who rescued an injured cat touched a nerve. People were moved by Mark's selfless act, by his willingness to go above and beyond for a creature in need. Donations started pouring in. The local community rallied around Rusty and Mark. People shared the story on social media, spreading the word far and wide. A local pet supply store set up a donation jar at their counter. A group of schoolchildren organized a bake sale to raise money. Even Bulldozer Bill, Mark's gruff foreman, surprised him by slipping a folded $100 bill into his hand, muttering something about doing the right thing. Meanwhile, Eleanor Davison was frantic with worry. Rusty had never been gone this long. She'd searched her house, her garden, the entire neighborhood, calling his name until her voice was hoarse. She'd put up lost cat posters with Rusty's picture, her hands trembling as she taped them to lampposts and trees. She was sitting at her kitchen table, staring at a picture of Rusty, tears streaming down her face, when her neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, knocked on her door. "Eleanor, dear, have you seen this?" Mrs. Henderson said, holding up her phone, showing Eleanor the article on the Harmony Creek Chronicle website. Eleanor's eyes widened as she saw the picture of Rusty, bandaged and lying on a vet's table. She recognized him instantly, despite his injuries. "That's him. That's my Rusty," she cried, a mixture of relief and terror flooding through her. She read the article, her heart pounding. She learned about Mark Olson, the construction worker who had found Rusty and taken him to the vet. She learned about the community's efforts to raise money for his surgery. She didn't hesitate. She grabbed her purse and her car keys, and with Mrs. Henderson's help, she drove to the Harmony Creek Veterinary Clinic, her heart filled with a desperate hope. Eleanor rushed into the Harmony Creek Veterinary Clinic, her face pale and etched with worry. Mrs. Henderson, her ever-supportive neighbor, steadied her arm. The waiting room, which had been bustling earlier, was now relatively quiet. "I'm here to see Rusty," Eleanor said to the receptionist, her voice trembling. "I saw the article online. He's my cat." The receptionist, the same young woman who had greeted Mark earlier, recognized Eleanor from the lost cat posters that had been circulating. Her face lit up with a smile. "Oh yes, Mrs. Davison, right? He's in surgery right now. The veterinarian, Dr. Carter, is operating on his leg." Eleanor's heart sank. "Surgery? Is he going to be all right?" "Dr. Carter is very optimistic," the receptionist reassured her. "He's a strong little guy, and he's had an amazing outpouring of support. A construction worker, Mr. Olson, found him and brought him in. He's been wonderful." Just then, Mark emerged from a hallway, his face weary but relieved. He saw Eleanor and Mrs. Henderson, and a look of understanding passed between them. "You must be Mrs. Davison," Mark said, his voice gentle. "I'm Mark Olson. I found Rusty." Eleanor's eyes welled up with tears. She reached out and took Mark's hand, her grip surprisingly strong. "Thank you," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "Thank you for saving my Rusty. He's everything to me." Mark, usually uncomfortable with displays of emotion, felt a lump form in his throat. "He's a tough little guy," he said, squeezing her hand. "He's a fighter." Mrs. Henderson, ever practical, stepped forward. "How is he, Mr. Olson? What did the vet say?" Mark explained the situation, describing Rusty's injuries and the surgery. He told Eleanor about the community's response, about the donations that had poured in to help cover the costs. Eleanor was overwhelmed. She couldn't believe the kindness of strangers, the generosity of people she'd never met. She was especially grateful to Mark, this rough-looking construction worker who had shown such compassion for her beloved cat. "I want to pay for everything," Eleanor insisted. "I can cover the costs of the surgery. You shouldn't have to worry about that." Mark shook his head. "The community has already taken care of most of it, ma'am. It's amazing. People have been so generous." He hesitated, then added, "But if you wanted to contribute something, maybe you could help with his aftercare. He's going to need medication and follow-up visits." Eleanor readily agreed. She would do anything for Rusty. Dr. Carter emerged from the operating room, her surgical mask pulled down, a tired but satisfied smile on her face. "The surgery went well," she announced. "The fracture was complex, but we were able to stabilize it. He's in recovery now, and he's doing as well as can be expected." Eleanor and Mark both let out sighs of relief. "Can I see him?" Eleanor asked, her voice pleading. "He's still groggy from the anesthesia," Dr. Carter said, "but you can see him for a few minutes. Just be quiet and gentle." They followed Dr. Carter to a small recovery room. Rusty was lying on a soft blanket, his leg bandaged, and 4 drip attached to his arm. He looked small and vulnerable, but he was alive. Eleanor knelt beside him, tears streaming down her face. She gently stroked his fur, whispering his name. "Oh, Rusty, my sweet boy," she murmured. I'm here now." Rusty stirred slightly, his eyelids fluttering. He opened his eyes, his gaze unfocused at first, then slowly settling on Eleanor. He let out a weak, raspy purr, a sound that was music to Eleanor's ears. Mark stood back, watching the reunion, a wave of emotion washing over him. He felt a profound sense of satisfaction, knowing that he'd made a difference. He'd saved a life, and in doing so, he'd brought 2 very different people together. The time waiting was long, but they spent it together. The following weeks were a blur of vet visits, medication, and anxious monitoring. Rusty, despite his ordeal, proved to be a remarkably resilient patient. His initial recovery was slow, marked by periods of lethargy and pain. He spent most of his time confined to a large crate, which Eleanor had painstakingly outfitted with soft blankets, his favorite toys, and a constant supply of fresh water and food. The first few days were the hardest. Rusty was weak and disoriented, still feeling the effects of the anesthesia and the trauma of the accident. He refused to eat, and Eleanor had to coax him with tiny spoonfuls of tuna and chicken broth. He whimpered frequently, his injured leg causing him obvious discomfort. But gradually he began to improve. His appetite returned, and he started to show glimpses of his old personality. He'd purr when Eleanor stroked his fur, and he'd bat playfully at a dangling toy, even though his movements were still clumsy. The bandage on his leg was a constant reminder of his ordeal. It was bulky and awkward, and he initially tried to chew it off, earning him a soft, cone-shaped collar that he absolutely detested. But he eventually adjusted, learning to navigate his crate and even take a few tentative steps with the aid of the bandage. Eleanor dedicated herself completely to Rusty's care. She meticulously followed Dr. Carter's instructions, administering his medication on schedule, changing his bandages, and monitoring his progress. She became an expert at coaxing him to eat, at recognizing the subtle signs of pain or discomfort, at providing the comfort and reassurance he needed. Her days revolved around Rusty. She'd sit beside his crate for hours, talking to him in soothing tones, reading aloud from her favorite books, or simply knitting. The rhythmic click of the needles a familiar and comforting sound for both of them. Her small house, which had felt empty and silent after George's death, was once again filled with life, albeit a quieter, more fragile kind of life. Rusty's presence, even in his weakened state, was a balm to her soul. Mark became a regular visitor. He'd stop by after work, still in his dusty construction clothes, bringing Rusty small gifts: a new catnip mouse, a soft, plush blanket, a bag of his favorite treats. He'd sit on the floor beside Rusty's crate, talking to him in his low, rumbling voice, stroking his fur with his calloused hands. Rusty would purr in response, his green eyes fixed on Mark with a mixture of gratitude and affection. Eleanor would often invite Mark to stay for dinner. At first, he was hesitant, feeling out of place in her cozy, flower-filled home. But Eleanor's genuine warmth and hospitality soon put him at ease. They'd sit at the kitchen table, sharing simple meals and stories. Eleanor would talk about her life with George, about her garden, about her love for Rusty. Mark would talk about his work, about the challenges and rewards of construction, about the camaraderie he shared with his co-workers. They were an unlikely pair, a widowed retiree and a gruff construction worker, but they found common ground in their shared love for a small, ginger cat. A bond of friendship formed between them, forged in the crucible of a shared crisis. The experience had a profound impact on Mark. He'd always been a practical man, focused on the tangible, the concrete. He'd never been particularly sentimental about animals, seeing them as creatures of instinct, not of emotion. But Rusty had changed that. He'd seen the cat's vulnerability, his pain, his resilience. He'd witnessed the power of kindness, the outpouring of support from the community. He'd felt the deep, unwavering bond between Eleanor and her beloved pet. He started to notice the small things he'd previously overlooked: the birds singing in the trees, the stray cats that roamed the construction site, the wildflowers that grew in the cracks of the pavement. He found himself becoming more compassionate, more aware of the interconnectedness of all living things. Months later, Rusty was almost fully recovered. He still had a slight limp, a permanent reminder of his ordeal, a barely noticeable scar hidden in the fur. But he was able to walk, run, and even jump, albeit with a bit less agility than before. It was a warm spring afternoon. Rusty was basking in his favorite sunny spot on the living room rug, the sunlight illuminating his ginger fur. Eleanor was sitting in her armchair, knitting, the click of the needles a familiar rhythm. There was a knock on the door. It was Mark, his face weathered and smiling. He held a small potted plant, a vibrant geranium with bright red flowers. "Thought you might like this for your garden," he said, handing the plant to Eleanor. "Oh, Mark, it's beautiful," Eleanor said, her eyes sparkling. "Thank you." Rusty, hearing Mark's voice, got up and stretched, then padded over to him, rubbing against his legs and purring loudly. Mark bent down and scratched him behind the ears, a familiar gesture of affection. The sounds of construction could still be heard in the distance, the faint rumble of trucks and the clang of steel. But they no longer held the same fear. They were simply sounds, part of the background noise of life. The three of them, Eleanor, Mark, and Rusty, were together, a small, unlikely family forged by adversity. The story ended on a note of hope, a testament to the enduring power of kindness, resilience, and the unexpected bonds that can blossom in the most unlikely of circumstances. The scar on Rusty's leg was a symbol, not of pain, but of survival, a reminder of the journey they had all taken together.